Hello and welcome to Social Church. We've got a really good question today. There are 8.7 million different species of animals and insects on the earth today. The question is, how on earth did they all fit on the ark? Who better to ask than the expert on Genesis, Nathaniel Jeanson. Thank you so much for your time, Nathaniel. I know you're a busy man. So, how did all of these species, 8.7 million animals, birds and insects, fit on the ark?
This is a great question. That's really the second half of a common skeptical derision of the scriptural account. So the first half of the skeptic's typical question is, Noah's Ark can't possibly be true because you can't possibly fit the 1.6 million species that exist today on board the ark.
Yeah, sure.
And of course the answer to that is Noah didn't have to fit all the 1.6 million species on board the ark. Number one, because he's not putting whales on the ark. It's a flood after all.
Yeah.
And number two, he's not going to fit likely not going to fit all the arthropods, spiders, insects, so forth. He's just bringing the land-dependent, air-breathing creatures on board the ark, which is basically mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds.
Yeah.
And the scripture doesn't even speak of species. Some English Bibles unfortunately use that term, but species is really a modern invention thanks to Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s.
Okay.
The Hebrew Bible speaks of kinds. That's typically the English word we use to translate the Hebrew word mean. So God creates creatures in Genesis chapter 1 according to their mean, and Noah's commanded to take creatures on board the ark according to their mean, their kinds. And if you look at what kinds are, Noah's commanded to take the male and female of each kind for the purpose of preserving their seed, their offspring. That implies then that if we can interbreed certain individuals, even if they're separate species, they're probably part of the same kind.
Yeah.
And applying that criterion to the animal world, there's a general rule that has emerged. There are species that can still produce live offspring today. As a general rule, the kind is not a species. The kind is not even a genus. That's the next level up of classification. So, for example, the red fox and the Arctic fox not only are separate species, they each are placed in their own genus.
Yeah.
That's not the level of kind either. Rather, the family level. So using the fox example, foxes, coyotes, wolves, dogs, dingoes all belong to the same family. The family is Canidae. And it's the family level of classification that's likely the best approximation for what the biblical kind is. So if you then ask the question, well, how many kinds, how many families did Noah have to bring on board the ark, living and extinct, you only come up with about less than 2,000. So the ark has plenty of room for these creatures.
Wow, okay.
Then, of course, that raises the question, you got families on board the ark, let's see, but there's now 30 plus species, hundreds of breeds of dogs within the dog family. That means you have a whole bunch of breeds and species from that pair on board the ark in, just a few thousand years? That's impossible. That's more evolution than Darwin proposed. That's sometimes how they'll state their argument against the scripture.
Yeah.
So what's the answer to that? One of the answers stems from something Darwin himself said. So one of his arguments for evolution that's sort of been lost in the modern discussion comes from the opening chapters of his book on the origin of species. In 1859, he was trying to argue against an archaic, outdated, unbiblical view of the origin of species. The older view back then was that God created species, not kinds, which is not biblically justified.
Yeah.
So he was just trying to find a way to argue against species being fixed and unchanging. And one of the things the arguments he gave in 1859 was a comparison. He said, let's compare the amount of variety that we see in the wild compared to the variety that we see on farms, on ranches. So we can use a modern version of this. If you look at the horse, donkey, zebra family, there's 3 species of zebras in existence today, 1 species of wild horse, the Przewalski's horse, wild asses, 2 in Asia, 1 in Africa.
Yeah.
7 species total. There's over 850 breeds of horses and donkeys in existence today. So Darwin said, and challenged his contemporary creationists who thought that God created species, he said, okay, let's think about this logically. Where do all the breeds come from? And so today we could say, where do the 700 plus breeds of horses come from?
Yeah.
Well, there's only one answer we can give, because we humans were responsible for producing them. We'll take, let's say, a long-haired black coat color horse and made it with a short-haired red coat color horse to try to produce a long-haired red colored coat colored horse, that sort of thing. That's what we've been doing for however long, hundreds of years, millennia, to produce the breeds we want. The answer to Darwin's rhetorical question is, well, of course, all these 700 breeds come from a common ancestor, because we humans were the ones doing this. So then Darwin, once he's established that in the minds of his readers, okay, yeah, breeds have a common ancestor, he turns around and says, okay, why would you say species do not have common ancestors? So if the greater amount of variety, and if you look at the amount of variety that exists in breeds, it's stupendous. All that variety comes from a common ancestor. Why wouldn't you turn around and say this lesser amount of variety, zebras, horses, donkeys in the wild, why would you say those don't have a common ancestor? And that's a pretty good argument. It has its limits, because you can't really tie rhinos or tapirs into this equation. They're the closest living relatives, according to evolutionists, of the horses and such. All the amount of variety in horse breeds doesn't bridge the gap between horses and rhinos. It's a good argument, nonetheless, that really fits, I think, this idea of biblical kinds. So the question, though, is the question of time. How could you get 7 species of horses from a pair, or 7 species of horses, donkeys, zebras, from a pair of equids on board the ark in just a few thousand years? And this is where we can take Darwin's argument to its logical conclusion. He didn't discuss the question of time. He just assumed millions of years in his arguments. And let's do it now then. Let's take it to its logical conclusion. So I'm going to make an argument within the evolutionary framework, use the evolutionists' own statements against them to show that we can very easily get breeds and species in just a few thousand years. So if you ask the evolutionists today about those 7 living equid species, 3 zebras, 3 asses, one horse, you say, well, how long did it take, evolutionarily speaking, for these species to arise? And the literature will tell you about 4 million years. 4 million years for 7 species. So, of course, they say that's ridiculous to say these 7 species happened in just a few thousand. And this is where I'd stop them and say, hold on. Tell me, evolutionists, tell me how long it took for the 700 breeds of horses to arise. So you think, for many, do the math, you say, okay, 7 species in the wild, 700 breeds, that's a 100-fold difference. 4 million years for the wilds, well, maybe it'd take 400 million years for the breeds. And that's not the answer you'll find in the literature. The evolutionists themselves say these 700-plus breeds arose not over 400 million years, but over just 12,000. So think of that. There's 700 breeds in just a few thousand years. 7 species in 4 million years. Those numbers don't make any sense. Using Darwin's own logic, you basically have to say, even within an evolutionary framework, if 700 breeds can arise in a few thousand years, then surely 7 species can. So from Darwin's own pen, we can make an argument showing the plausibility of species in a few thousand years. Of course, I don't accept the 12,000-year time scale. That was just to show that the evolutionists can't even make a consistent argument against the young Earth model. I'd say it goes down to a few thousand years, 4,500 or so. But looking at what's been done on the farm immediately makes all the more plausible what we've seen in the wild. So that's one of many arguments we could make showing that this is quite plausible. And actually, genetically, it goes back to this idea of big A, big B, little b. If animals, these kinds, were created genetically homogeneous, with no variety in their DNA, all capital letters or all lowercase letters, then yeah, it's pretty hard to create species, to make species in a few thousand years. However, if God creates these kinds with capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b, and you do that for the millions of DNA positions that exist, you're going to exhaust all the letters of the English alphabet and more. That means they have the potential to produce all sorts of variety in a single generation. We now have multiple lines of evidence indicating that this was indeed the case. This is how God created the kinds in the beginning. So they had the potential within themselves to form all sorts of species in sort of an evolutionary heartbeat. And the reason the evolutionists have not come to this conclusion is because they reject from the outset this idea that there could have been front-loaded genetic variety. They say, nope, everything must be the result of genetic mistakes. This precludes them from even considering the possibility that there were front-loaded genetic information, front-loaded genetic variety at the start. And so they've missed this incredible explanation for how so many species can arise in just a few thousand years. But we can see the echo of it in the breeds that have formed. Those are formed not by and large, not by farmers going in and mutating the DNA of horses. They're just taking what exists, the variety that already exists in their genetics, and just reshuffling it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's absolutely brilliant. Really good stuff. If you have a question that you would like us to answer in a later episode, you have a perfect opportunity. We have a form set up on our website, www.wearesocialchurch.com. Just fill in the form, and then hopefully we'll have a chance to be able to get to your question and answer it in a later episode. Thanks a lot for listening, and speak to you soon. Bye-bye.